Hi, I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. Today on Squawk Pod, trade war.
If they don't stop it, the tariffs are going to get worse, a lot worse.
President Trump slapping tariffs on America's biggest trading partners, possibly as soon as midnight.
Canada's been very abusive of the United States for many years.
Canada's prime minister says our closest neighbor is prepared to fight back.
This is a choice that, yes, will harm Canadians, but beyond that, it will have real consequences for you, the American people. But it doesn't have to be this way.
We have the numbers. Reporter Megan Cassella in D.C.
The tariffs will cover about $1.25 trillion in goods, about 40% of everything that the U.S. buys from abroad. That's more than triple the level that Trump set tariffs on in his first term. And Phil LeBeau on the hit to the auto industry, which relies heavily on North American partners.
The cost impact is $6,250 per vehicle, and most of that is likely going to be passed along to the car buyer.
But news during our broadcast from the White House North Lawn, Kevin Hassett, one of the president's top economic advisors, tells us Canada may be misunderstood.
President Trump was absolutely 100% clear that this is not a trade war, this is a drug war.
Is this still a negotiation? Key calls are set for today between leaders.
President Trump will then see what people have to offer and then make the call.
Plus, the weekend's other major headline, the richest man in the world remaking government. Elon Musk held a live Spaces discussion on X at midnight to talk about what the Doge team has done so far and its plans now that Musk has access to the U.S. Treasury's payment system. Reporter Steve Kovach.
This is right out of the Twitter playbook. Blasted spending, threatened employees, told them they have to get out.
It's Monday, February 3rd, 2025. Squawk Pod begins right now.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We're live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. I'm Becky Quick along with Andrew Ross Sorkin. Joe is out today.
Tonight, I am announcing Canada will be responding to the U.S. trade action with 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods.
No, I'm not concerned. We may have short-term some little pain, and people understand that, but long-term, the United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world. We have deficits with almost every country, not every country, but almost, and we're going to change it. It's been unfair.
The U.S. announcing 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico that are due to kick in at midnight tonight. Also, an additional 10% tariff on China. Megan Cassella joins us right now with more of this breaking news over the weekend. And Megan, so many questions about whether this will be imposed, how long it will be imposed, what would be reasons for lifting some of those tariffs if they are imposed at this point. What are you seeing right now? Wrap it all up for us.
Everything's out there, Becky. It's interesting that there is still a lot of skepticism that these will even take effect when every indication that we've gotten over the past 3 days or so, really since Thursday, Friday last week, was that they would. But we'll get into some of those questions. But first, this is an opening salvo that I would say goes much further than what we were seeing in Trump's first term. The tariffs will cover about $1.25 trillion in goods, about 40% of everything that the U.S. buys from abroad. That's more than triple the level that Trump set tariffs on in his first term. There will be no exemptions, meaning no company can apply for a carve-out for their products. And the White House removed this rule that used to allow low-value packages to come in without paying tariffs, dealing a blow there to small businesses and fast fashion retailers. Trump is also acknowledging this time around that the tariffs could bring some economic pain, but he does say that the end goal of making America great again will be worth the price that must be paid. Now, the tariffs are set to take effect at midnight tonight. Trump does say, Becky, that he'll be talking with both Mexican and Canadian leaders. This morning, Mexico's president also says that she will be detailing what their retaliation will look like later today. So there is that small window left to work out a deal, to get back to your original question, but it's still not clear what would satisfy Trump's concerns right now that are centered on fentanyl and border security, or at least what would satisfy them before midnight tonight. Becky?
Canada has already come out and said what their initial retaliatory impacts would be. About $20 billion of imports from the United States, things like alcohol, coffee, clothing, and shoes. furniture, household appliances. And they're going to be targeting areas that are Republican-led, things like whiskeys from Kentucky, oranges from Florida, appliances from South Carolina. There's a second wave that is expected of about $85 billion that would include cars and trucks, agricultural products, steel and aluminum, aerospace products. So more to come on these fronts. And you've got Ontario and British Columbia that are already moving to block the sale of U.S. wines. I think Ontario alone, according to the Wall Street Journal, makes up about $700 million a year in sales of U.S. wine. So you could feel the impact rather quickly. Not a trade war at this point, but if you see the retaliatory measures, and then President Trump has said that he would raise the tariffs even further if there was retaliation, that's when you start to wonder where things go.
That's a key point, that there is this retaliation clause right in the president's executive order saying that he can and will likely raise these tariffs further once the other countries retaliate. All three countries say that they will. We're going to hear more from Mexico today about what exactly they're targeting. And while Canada is giving themselves a few weeks to get to their second round, there's talk, too, of things like Tesla specifically maybe seeing a 100% tariff. Obviously, that's more bluster than it is bite, but it's the kind of thing that we're likely to see in the coming days as these countries get more into it. And that's what the president could react to. He's going to be watching the markets today. He's going to be watching the currency today. You guys have been talking about the dollar. Scott Bessent has been saying before his confirmation that he doesn't want to see the dollar strengthen against other countries, that wouldn't be good to see it strengthen against other currencies. So watching things like the markets, seeing specifically what they're going to be targeting, seeing consumer reaction, some lawmaker reaction, though I should note we're seeing a lot of support from Republicans on the Hill, but a lot to still watch here in the coming days.
Yeah, we're looking at the dollar right now. It's up 1% against the Canadian dollar today. It's up 1.6% right now against the Mexican peso. It had been up about 2% earlier today. But remember, that's after we saw a very strong dollar all the way through the fourth quarter, to the point that it was an issue that a lot of companies have had to start talking about, international companies or multinational companies that are based in the United States talk about that strong dollar and how it does lessen the profits that they're bringing back from overseas. So we'll continue to hear that and kind of keep a focus on it as it comes through the earnings season, too. Megan, thank you very much.
Meantime, President Trump's tariffs against Mexico and Canada, they're going to have a deep impact on the auto industry and also potentially future car buyers. So we wanted to get to our automobile expert. Phil LeBeau is with us this morning, who's been going through all of this over the weekend. Lots of different impacts, and I'm so curious what folks in Detroit are talking about right now, Phil.
They're talking about how they can limit the impact of these tariffs, not only in terms of finished automobiles, but also with auto parts. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Let me give you some perspective in terms of how many vehicles that are sold in this country or were sold last year came from Mexico and Canada. And more of the production, 2/3 of the production of those imported vehicles coming from Mexico, 3.72 million vehicles. Now, these are vehicles that were sold in the U.S., 16% built in Mexico, 7% built in Canada, which raises the natural question. Okay, well, if the tariffs go into effect, how much will the price that I pay at a dealership change? It's hard to know, because it's hard to know how much of this will be eaten by the companies, passed along to consumers, adjusted because of shifted production. But S&P Global Mobility estimates that the cost impact is $6,250 per vehicle. And most of that is likely going to be passed along to the car buyer if these tariffs continue and they last over time. And again, the automakers, we heard this from Mary Barra last week, they are trying to or will try to adjust their production as much as possible.
Specifically related to Mexico, we've planned a lot of different scenarios, and there's adjustments that we can make. It's hard to say when we don't know exactly what the tariffs might be or how long they're going to last, what steps we'll take. But I'm confident that we have many levers to pull to not have as great an impact as some may be forecasting if there are tariffs on Mexico.
Who can do that and who can't depends on how exposed you are, primarily to Mexico. And we'll talk about Canada, I know, in the days and weeks to come. But I'm just focusing on Mexico at this very moment. The percentage of U.S. sales coming from plants in Mexico, VW by far almost half of its U.S. sales coming from down there. There you see Nissan. And then the big three, Stellantis, GM, Ford, the least exposed. It has the most of its U.S. production or U.S. sales coming from production in the United States. As you take a look at the shares of GM, Ford, Stellantis, all of them took a really substantial hit. I'd say on Wednesday, they were all down about 1%. That carried through on Thursday and Friday. What is the potential impact on earnings? And again, a lot of this depends on how much they are able to offset. Worst case scenario, according to Tom Narian at RBC Capital Markets. And again, this is a worst case scenario. 21% hit to earnings for GM, 15% for Ford, Stellantis at 12%, and an almost 10% hit to Volkswagen. I mentioned the auto parts suppliers. They're probably in a bigger pickle than the automakers. Why? Automakers have a number of plants where they can shift around production to potentially limit the impact of tariffs. Not the case with a number of the auto suppliers. And remember, more than half of the auto parts and components used in vehicles built in the United States are coming in from Mexico and Canada, and they can't adjust that production. So it'll be interesting to see how many of these adjustments can be made, and it partially depends on how long this tariff lasts.
What do you make of Tesla shares, by the way, higher this morning?
Well, some of that will be people saying they have the most American-made vehicles at their plant down in Texas, as well as their plant out in California. And there's some truth to that. Keep in mind, they also have far fewer components. And so the components that they do have, most of those are sourced in the United States. So if you're playing the tariff game, you look at Tesla and you say, well, they're the least impacted by anybody. Keep in mind also that EVs are such a small percentage of overall U.S. auto sales relative to the market overall that it's hard to sit there. I don't think there's going to be anybody saying, well, I want to go where I can get the least impacted vehicle. I'm going to go to a Tesla. A lot of other things are in play there.
Okay. Phil LeBeau, we're going to keep our eyes on all of this, of course, and I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more to you about all of it as well. Thank you.
You have rule of the bureaucracy. And this is obviously wrong. It is unconstitutional. And it is imperative, therefore, that we return power to the people of the country. It's not just that there's an unconstitutional fourth branch of the government, but it is arguably the most powerful branch of the government.
Now let's get to the other story of the weekend. They're all interrelated, though. We're talking Elon Musk this time, going after multiple parts of the government over the weekend, then holding a spaces discussion happening on X, his own site, at midnight last evening. And Steve Kovach stayed up late and is up early to tell us exactly what took place.
Yeah, a lot took place here. I mean, I think the big headline, guys, out of this Twitter Spaces, it was supposed to be a status update on Doge, but really went after what Elon Musk called the fourth estate of the government and blaming them for a lot of stuff and calling USAID in particular a criminal organization. And the big headline out of here is that Elon Musk said that President Trump gave him the permission to end USAID.
None of this could be done without the full support of the president. With regard to the USAID stuff, I went over it with him, in detail, and he agreed with that we should shut it down.
Now, this is an organization that distributes $40 billion a year in aid across the world for various charities and things like that. And then there was just a whole bunch of allegations without evidence kind of lobbed at USAID, calling it a criminal organization. Even at one point, Musk was saying that it provided funding to the Chinese lab in China, in Wuhan, where they think COVID came from, and therefore the U.S. indirectly funded the creation of COVID. Just a lot of wild stuff and a lot of wild accusations, which I will say, no evidence or real backing of what's going on here. But I think the main lesson here, guys, is a lot of interesting stuff said on this call, but we're really watching the Twitter playbook play out here. When Elon Musk took over Twitter 2.5 years ago, this fork in the road email, this idea of going into agencies, claiming fraud, even though there wasn't, not paying bills and things like that. We're seeing this play out now in the federal government from Elon Musk, and last night, this conversation around Doge and what's going on. It's the first of many, by the way. They're going to do this every week now, talking about it.
in any detail what it means for him to have access to the Treasury's payment systems?
They didn't get into that. That was another
I think that
interesting.
is the other. It might even be the main story that took place over the weekend, beyond obviously the tariff story, which is to say that his team is inside the Treasury payment system. There's been now a Treasury official who's departed as a result of.
But the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, apparently gave him the keys to the car here.
But what that means, meaning, to me, there's one view, which is, are you in there to examine and understand how the system works? Who gets paid, when they get paid, so that you can start to try to look at things, or is it that they're actually looking and specifically, pressing the toggle, saying off. We're not that payment off, this payment on, that payment off, this. And
there was some allusion
and how much
to that.
authority he has to do that. There was talk over the weekend. There's this Lutheran Social Services. I don't know if you saw that. Mike Flynn making note of that. It's a service. The government. It's a not-for-profit. The government gives them money. They give money for refugees, for folks who have autism. They do. The United States has outsourced to not-for-profits around the country all sorts of work.
Right.
And so the question is whether this group, sort of on an ad hoc basis, has unilateral control to say, what, we're going to pay that, we're not going to pay that, like that.
It wasn't direct. It is, and he didn't directly address that yesterday. But what he did say was, we're saving something like billions a day, and.
With the record, how he was saving the billions.
But with the recognition, though, that there's a $7 trillion in spending, and we're only cutting a couple billion a day. That was the only thing I saw that could be it. Again, he gave no details on that, but that was the only thing I saw, that they're going through these outflows of payments from the Treasury, right, and saying, okay, let's kill this one, let's kill this one, let's kill this one.
It's just, there are so many questions about how this was appropriated when it went through Congress. If you can do that, if the executive branch has the authority to do some of these things. Now, look, Elon Musk has made the point, live by the executive order, die by the executive order. So if you're something that was put in place by a previous executive order, the White House absolutely can strip that out. But if it was put in place by law, and USAID was signed into law and executive order. So there were two things. It was signed into law by Congress. There was also an executive order that went along with it. So that's where some of the confusion comes in. But there are senators who are raising questions about these things.
And I have a letter from the Senate Foreign Relations, the Democrat leaders on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, writing to Marco Rubio, saying, why is this happening? How is this able to happen? We're not seeing much pushback on the Republican side, of course, and kind of allowing this to happen. In fact, yesterday, Musk was joined by Joni Ernst and Senator Mike Lee. So two Republican senators who were full-throatedly endorsing this. And again, there were some really wild accusations made. I mean, the COVID one I just mentioned about us sending money to China to create COVID. I mean, that is just one of the more ludicrous ones.
I'm just more concerned about the payment system in a way, because ultimately, look, the agency, all of these different agencies authorize payments.
Right.
And historically, the payment system, meaning the Treasury's payment group, just made the payments. Their responsibility was not to ascertain whether it was a good payment or a bad payment, whether the money was being used effectively, not effectively.
Congress said to spend it,
whether they liked the agencies or didn't like the agencies. I understand why using that prism, meaning, yes, if you have access to that area, you should be able to study in a that is the place you would go to study what's going on and to be able to identify potential places. But then the question is...
It sounds like they're going a step further, right?
But I guess where I'm going is, you should be able to... The good news is you can identify stuff that you may think is suspect or shouldn't be paid or whatnot.
Right.
And then the question is, are you supposed to, I think, from a protocol perspective, go back to the agency that authorized said payment for whatever reason and say you shouldn't be making said payment? And then, obviously, there'll be a fight and debate. And that's bureaucratic. I get that. But
that doesn't sound like what's happening.
But can I say that
because he's coming out here saying, I'm going to kill USAID. The president told me to kill this organization, and we're going to cut all the funding.
Right.
This is very different than what we thought originally, which was this was going to be Simpson Bowles 2.0.
Exactly.
Where you had
which was ineffective, by the way.
And by the way, it was completely ineffective, and President Obama chose not to follow the recommendations of that panel. They did not make this if the vote stands, you have to do an up-down vote that goes through Congress. That's what I thought we were going to be dealing with. But then there were questions because at the same time, can you be in a position of making these and still own all the other, be involved in all the other organizations that he runs at the same time?
That's another thing too. But right now, I didn't hear anything last night that appeared to be in conflict with him running his other companies. There was the issue with the FAA and the director of the FAA kind of getting pushed out. I understand that, but last night on the spending side,
it's like this is just going to be a commission that makes recommendations.
And that does nothing. And that is how it was in theory set up, right? And
that's how we understood it.
And that was the immediate thing.
Obviously, we did not get it.
And we thought Congress would have an appetite to protect its spending power, and it's not doing that. It is kind of taking a back seat and letting this happen. And Musk has apparently been given the authority to look at these Treasury payments, to stop payments where he thinks they should be.
It's a heck of a lot more
USAID, to your point, that Lutheran organization, calling that a criminal organization.
Yeah.
I mean, these are just, again, this is right out of the Twitter playbook when you just went through, blasted spending, threatened employees, told them they have to get out. That's great for Twitter. A lot of people probably think X is a better product today than it was before.
Yeah.
The whole thing when this started, guys, was he did this amazing thing at Twitter. He came in, cut all the fat out, and Twitter is like a better product than it ever was. You can argue that, of course. It is a much worse business than it ever was. We know that because Fidelity is marking it down. We know that its revenue is just a fraction of what it used to be. There's some talk of advertisers returning. How do you apply that to the government, though, and when people's lives are at stake? This is not about the ability to tweet. This is about, providing $40 billion in aid that might be needed around the world.
I'm still, by the way, I just want to be clear. I'm still long X, even on a valuation perspective. Because of XAI.
We'll see.
I think
You don't think they got deep-seeked last week?
No. Steve,
thanks, guys.
Thank you for staying up late and waking up early, and I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more very, very soon. Thanks.
Cheese will be next.
Up next on Squawk Pod, we go to the White House North Lawn, where President Trump's National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett sets the record straight on these tariffs, trade war, or drug war.
People need to read the executive order. President Trump has said this is about the fentanyl crisis.
He says Canada has misinterpreted the tariffs, and it's really all about a drug crisis.
Canada is like San Francisco, and it's spreading to the U.S., and it needs to stop. And that's what the Canadian people want, and it's what the American people want, too.
We'll be right back. This is Squawk Pod.
Up and Andrew, Hugh.
We're watching Squawk Box on CNBC on this Monday morning. I don't want to call it a special edition, but it's almost a special edition of the broadcast, given just all of the wild headlines and what's happening in the market right now. I'm Andrew Ross Sorkin along with Becky Quick. Joe is out. He's going to be back soon, though.
Joining us right now is White House National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett. And Kevin, thank you for being with us this morning. Got a lot of questions and hoping you can give us a little insight into what's happening. First of all, are there talks taking place behind the scenes that could potentially stop these tariffs before they go in? Or is it your understanding that these will take effect at midnight tonight?
There have been a heck of a lot of talks over the weekend. I've been in the White House for most of the weekend, and the thing I can say is that I think it's totally 100% being miscovered, this story. What you need to do is go back and read the executive order where President Trump was absolutely 100% clear that this is not a trade war, this is a drug war. There are perhaps 100,000 people last year that died of fentanyl, and the fentanyl is coming in across the Mexican and Canadian borders. 80, 90, 95% of Mexicans want the drug war to end, and the same is true in Canada. And I can tell you, I spent a lot of time in Canada. I was up in Alberta and walking on the rivers and fishing last summer, and I can tell you that there are places in big cities in Canada that look kind of like San Francisco because the drug war is being lost by this government in Canada as well. The good news is that in our conversations over the weekend, one of the things we've noticed is that the Mexicans are very, very serious about doing what President Trump said in the executive order, and that is getting more aggressive, much, much more aggressive about the drug war. But the Canadians appear to have misunderstood the plain language of the executive order, and they're interpreting it as a trade war. And I think that that's probably consistent with the policies that we've seen from this failed government in the past, where they've let their own drug problem get out of control. And instead of addressing the drug problem, they want to blame the U.S. and perhaps get some political benefit out of saying that Trump's tried to create a trade war. Why would he do that with Canada and Mexico? This is 100% about a drug war. It's 100% about fentanyl. And more people died last year than died in the Vietnam War. And President Trump has vowed to Americans that he's going to make that stop.
All right, Kevin, this is really interesting. Just the idea that maybe there's something that could be negotiated. Let me just make sure that I'm understanding this correctly from you. There's something that could be negotiated in the next 24 hours, in the next several days, that would mean the tariffs would either not be put on or would come back if it were to satisfy President Trump's concerns about what's happening at the border and the protections there that are taking this. I mean, we're calling it a trade war because Canada has already said that they're going to retaliate across the board with, tariffs on alcohol, coffee, clothing and shoes, furniture, household appliances, whiskeys, fruit from Florida, all of these issues. You're saying that this is really more of a negotiation to try and say, no, we want more focus on the border, and if you give that to us, these go away?
This is not what I'm saying. People need to read the executive order. President Trump has said this is about the fentanyl crisis, right? No, but so I don't know how somebody reads the executive order if you're Canada and then comes back and says, we're going to start a trade war. We're saying we're really, really serious about going after fentanyl, and President Trump means it. And so there's all this fentanyl shipping across the borders. There, in the past, have been caravans of people parading across our border, carrying drugs and other things. And the response of our neighbors has not been, hey, we're going to help you stop this problem. It's go ahead and build a wall. So imagine, Becky, if I had like all this stuff going on in my house next to yours and all this stuff was leaking into your property. And then you say, Kevin, you got to stop all that crime in your place. And I'm like, hey, you know what? Becky, build a wall. That's disrespectful. And this is the attitude the president has towards what's going on right now. He wants them to be respectful of the United States and help solve the problem rather than feed it.
So this
and
is
we've
really
made a
just
lot of
the
progress
opening.
with the Mexicans.
This is really just the opening. Okay, so Mexico is really where the biggest problem for fentanyl is. We had one of our reporters earlier this morning, I haven't seen these figures myself, say that something like only 40 pounds of fentanyl was found at the Canadian border versus a much huger position down in the south part of this border. This is a way to get people to the table to say we are going to attack this and work with you, and that would call off all of these tariffs that are going to be put in place?
President Trump will decide what he's going to call off and what he's not, but he wants everybody at the table.
I think that's the confusion. There's not a clear set of standards that say if you do X, Y, and Z, this won't happen.
Well, they clearly haven't done it in the past, and the amount of organized crime in the fentanyl space in Canada is also very disturbing. And so it's not just a measure of like 40 pounds here and there. The fact is the president has set a very clear guideline for people to work with him collaboratively. These are some of our best trading partners and our best friends to solve this incredible problem that has been spinning out of control, and that they've not really been addressing. And again, in Edmonton last summer, I walked out of my hotel and they had an ambulance there helping somebody who had OD'd, sadly, on fentanyl. And then as I'm walking to my restaurant, two people get in a fight with the cops over drugs right there just in downtown Edmonton. And this is just my one day when I'm staying there. And the fact is that Canada is like San Francisco, and it's spreading to the U.S., and it needs to stop. And that's what the Canadian people want, and it's what the American people want too.
Kevin, I won't dissuade you of your views or perspectives. I think the question mark on all of this is, do you need to implement the tariffs to gain leverage in these negotiations? Were the threat of tariffs enough or not? I'm reading the Wall Street Journal, which historically has come out on the side of Republicans and conservatives. They call it the dumbest trade war. And there's a question of how long, again, to Becky's question, this goes on. You would imagine you'd have more leverage, frankly, the longer it goes on. But there's the flip side, which is how palatable it is for the American public to take whatever pain is inflicted in the short term as well.
The thing I would say, Aaron, and I hope Joe's feeling better, by the way. I miss him today. The thing that I would say is that in the end, what President Trump has not only created a lot of leverage for the United States in this negotiation, but he's given the politicians in Canada and Mexico an enormous amount of leverage, because the people of Canada, they don't want to have a drug war that they lose, and the people of Mexico don't either. And now, because President Trump has raised the level and made it clear that this is the number one policy issue for the United States this weekend, then all people in Canada and Mexico will support actions by those politicians to get ahead of the curve on the drug war. And so I think he's doing the politicians a favor.
Kevin, if you were at it listening to any of the NHL games this weekend in Canada, they were booing the Star-Spangled Banner. I mean, we are losing a lot of goodwill. And I just wonder, is this negotiation one that is simply on the drug trade when you have President Trump also saying that Europe is next? Where does it come down with Europe? This seems like this is something that's being used more broadly, I understand it, to negotiate better positions for Americans. It seems like it is much more than a drug war.
This matter this weekend is 100% about the drug war, and I think that the outcome is likely to be very positive for Americans, Canadians, and Mexicans, because President Trump is forcing politicians throughout the continent to take this matter seriously, and there'll probably be a lot of cheers from Canadians as President Trump meets the Stanley Cup champions today, too, as well.
Kevin, can you react to this? So Scott Bessent, who's now the Treasury Secretary, wrote a letter January 31st, 2024, to his own investors. This is Key Square Capital Management. And he wrote the following: tariffs are inflationary. This is our Treasury Secretary who wrote this, not at the time, though, would strengthen the dollar. Hardly a good starting point for a U.S. industrial renaissance. So he's saying this is hardly a good starting point for a U.S. industrial renaissance. This is our Treasury Secretary saying this. Goes on to say the tariff gun will always be loaded and on the table, but rarely discharged. In this case, it was discharged. Can you just react to what he was saying?
I've not read what Scott was saying. I've certainly talked about tariffs with him quite a bit over the years and months. I've known Scott for many years. And the thing is that President Trump's agenda is a massive, massive supply-side agenda that's going to include big tax cuts, big deregulation, fairer trade policy, drill baby drill, and the idea that if you were to look at like the worst model outcome of tariffs by themselves and say that President Trump's going to create inflation is basically means that you're going to get an F from me in my intro economics class. The fact is, you need to look at all the policies together. And, frankly, if you do, I think this is going to be one of the biggest supply side positive shocks that we've ever seen. And finally, I just want to say, going back to Canada, if I'm a market guy, as Scott was, I'd be getting bullish on Canada and Mexico, because the political pressure on these people who've been making really, really bad choices is going to be very, very great. And the idea that a renaissance like you're seeing in the U.S. could happen throughout the world, I think, is really, really bullish for global economies.
Kevin, I know you well. We've known each other for a long time.
For sure.
It doesn't sound to me, it doesn't sound to me like you think these tariffs are either going to go into effect, or if they do, that they will last for long. I mean, you know far better than we do what kind of negotiations are taking place behind the scenes. And it sounds like you think Mexico is more willing to play and more willing to find solutions to these things than you think Canada is, based on what you've seen so far.
So far, President Trump is going to decide all of this, at a time that he chooses. But there are positive conversations that have happened over the weekend, and there are positive conversations that are going to happen between the leaders of these countries, over the next hours. And President Trump will then see what people have to offer and then make the call. But I can tell you that everybody's been very impressed by the seriousness of the Mexicans, the fact that they read the executive order and understood it, whereas the Canadians either didn't read it or were misrepresenting it to the Canadian people for political gain rather than trying to solve Canada's problems. And if you wonder why Canada has so many problems right now, it's because they have politicians like that.
I would ask you the economic implications. Steve Liesman's here. He did a flash survey asking a bunch of economists what they saw. I think every one of them in that flash survey said that if these tariffs did go into place, they expected GDP to go down and inflation to go up. Did you all run your own economic potential impact at the administration?
We're working on getting the final numbers for the president's budget as we speak. But I can tell you that the growth that we saw in President Trump's first term pre-COVID is looking like it's going to be a low number compared to what we get when we run all of president policies through the president's budget. And again, I would ask people to do this, and I've been very public about this on your show last fall, that if you want to analyze the policy effect of the Trump administration, you need to look at all of them and not just take like a couple of papers that say that tariffs are bad and say that's the whole thing that's going to happen. But if we model the whole thing, that we're definitely getting growth that is, as President said, looks like a golden age to us. And as you remember, Becky, that when we did this, we had a huge report where for every single policy, we went through the academic literature and quantified why we thought we're going to get 0.5% from here and 3/4 from there and so on.
Right.
And we're doing that again.
I guess my question would be it's much broader than one simple economic policy. I think you're right. They all have to be taken together. But I think it's more than just economic policy that we're talking about here, too. This is national security. This is defense, and I wonder, are there experts in those arenas who are in the room when these negotiations and discussions are taking place?
Absolutely there are. And again, if you go back and think about the 100,000 people whose lives were lost because of fentanyl last year, and then think about it, in terms of the way the economies value gains and losses, in government cost-benefit analysis, we say that each life costs us about $10 million. So think about, we're talking $1 trillion loss every year because of fentanyl. And so if we take some costs to fix that, then of course it's going to pass any cost-benefit test and any test of humanity as well. The president's serious about solving this problem, and he's going to do it. He's going to do it.
Kevin, the president can look to the drug war and raise tariffs as a result, because tariffs are really the province of Congress to put on. If there's a national emergency like this, the president can say that he's going to raise tariffs as a result. When he says the European Union is next, what is the reasoning, what is the emergency there that would give him the authority to do that?
Well, we'll see what happens when we analyze it. The president has broad, long-run views about how tariffs could be part of a smart tax reform, and then he's got near-term things that he's trying to solve, like the fentanyl crisis. And the fact is that it's a very, very serious problem. It is an emergency when more people die last year than died during the entire Vietnam War, and that's why the president has put this right at the top of the agenda just as he's taking office.
And I guess one thing we've been trying to figure out, maybe you have more clarity on this, I'm sure you understand it better than I do. The president has said that he wants to do this to fight the drug war, meaning that if we can handle that, then the tariffs won't be put in place. But we've also talked to other people in the administration, including Peter Navarro, who've pointed out that, look, we're planning on raising money from some of these tariffs, that would be part of our way of balancing the budget. If it's a negotiation and we get what we want on that front and the tariffs aren't there, how do you fill the hole that would then be left for the money we thought we were going to raise?
Right. Again, for this matter, for this emergency order, it's about drugs and it's about the drug war. It's not about a trade war. And if in the future, as part of an overall reshaping of the tax code, the president uses tariffs and big supply side tax cuts to create a golden age, then he'll do that. He's going to study that and let us know his final decision on that as the months come over the next few months. But right now, this issue is 100% about the drug war, not about the trade war.
Okay. Kevin, I want to thank you very much for being with us.
Great to see you again.
It's great to see you too. And this does, I think,
from the White House lawn, no less.
From the White House lawn, and I think that matters because I think this is messaging that is being sent out. I think this is clearly part of that negotiation too. Kevin, we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Vic.
Don't go anywhere. More to come on Squawk Pod reaction to that newsmaking interview with Kevin Hassett from our economics reporter, Steve Liesman.
What causes recessions? It's the idling of productive capacity. Having recessions in our northern and southern neighbors, and by the way, our top trading partners, is not necessarily the best for the U.S. export economy.
Welcome back to Squawk Pod from CNBC. Here's Becky Quick.
Now to some additional tariff reaction from Wall Street. The economics team from Goldman Sachs, led by Jan Hatzius, says that the outlook is unclear, but that they do expect the Canada and Mexico tariffs to be short-lived. Goldman's chief U.S. equity strategist, David Kostin, writing, large tariffs pose downside risk to our S&P 500 earnings estimates and return expectations. J.P. Morgan's Michael Ferroli also noting that using fentanyl as a justification could provide a quicker off-ramp than more traditional applications of the Trade Act. He says, qualitatively, tariffs should push up prices and depress growth, but J.P. Morgan is holding off on changing its forecast because of the uncertainties around that implementation and potential retaliation. Bank of America Global Research notes that companies are better positioned this time for China tariffs because China exposure has been reduced by more than a third since 2018. But tariffs on Mexico are likely to be more painful as import exposure has risen since 2018. Speaking of tariff retaliation, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, says that he is banning American companies from contracts within his province. He said that would effectively shut off U.S. companies out of tens of billions of dollars in new revenue from those contracts. As a result, Ford said that he is ripping up the province's contract with Starlink because, in his words, Ontario won't do business with people hell-bent on destroying our economy. So we'll see. Now, for one of the biggest questions facing Wall Street this morning, are President Trump's new tariffs temporary or permanent? Our senior economics reporter, Steve Liesman, is here. He's trying to take a look at that issue. What do you think, Steve?
We'll come back to what Kevin Hassett said,
Yeah,
I think, in just a
that
second.
Kind of clarified some thinking for me.
Along with a brief I just got from the White House. But President Trump has linked the new tariffs to progress on issues like fentanyl, immigration, and trade deficits, suggesting actions by Mexico, Canada, and China could undo them. But he's made other comments that suggest there actually may be no way to get rid of them anytime soon. He posted on Truth Social this weekend, make your product in the USA and there are no tariffs. That suggests a different and more permanent underpinning for these moves. When campaigning in October 2024, he said, when we were a smart country in the 1890s, this is when the country was relatively the richest it ever was. It had all tariffs. It didn't have an income tax. Trump has praised President William McKinley. He had the nickname the Napoleon of tariffs and raised, or Napoleon of protectionism, and raised U.S. tariffs from 38 to 50%. More importantly, President Trump needs revenue to pay for his tax cuts and efforts to reduce the deficit at the same time. A year ago, Scott Bessent, now Treasury Secretary, was among those supporters of candidate Trump, suggesting tariffs would be rare and used as a negotiating tool. He told his investors, according to the Wall Street Journal at the time, the tariff gun will always be loaded and on the table, but rarely discharged. And yet Trump is threatening additional tariffs on Europe, as well as tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and computer chips. Wall Street more or less bought this temporary tariff spin. Morgan Stanley writing over the weekend, full implemented tariffs with staying power don't appear to be in the price of key markets. So despite assurances tariffs would be rare and just used as negotiating tools, markets should at least be thinking about the notion that tariffs could instead be widespread and important revenue measures that are more permanent for the Trump administration.
You know, I will say, after our conversation with Kevin Hassett, who was standing on the White House lawn, obviously an economic advisor to the president on these issues, I changed my thinking to some extent.
I heard it.
Because he didn't really seem to want to talk about the economics of what this means. He wanted to talk about how other parties, Canada and Mexico, but mainly Canada, he thought were misinterpreting what the executive orders were trying to accomplish. That seemed to me like it was almost like, hey, just give us something we can say that we have a win here, and this will go away.
I'm going to give you the most critical explanation, then I'll walk it back.
Yeah.
Some of this has been a bit like boiling the frog, right? Okay? Don't worry, they're temporary. Don't worry, they're temporary. You remember Lutnick was on, or all these guys during the campaign. They'll be rare and temporary.
Over the weekend, I thought it was real, and they really wanted this to come on, and there was going to be something coming from this. After that conversation, I thought maybe they don't.
But you heard those comments by President Trump. Bring it back to the United States and pay no tariff. What does that tell you? Is that a temporary tariff? If he gets rid of the tariffs that he's going to put on Canada, that doesn't change the issue of Britain making it the United States. Look, he has a different idea about how to tax the country and where revenue ought to come from. He's praised tariffs as being the best solution to a lot of different problems. So I don't know. I feel like there's two different things going on. I think Kevin wants these things to be temporary. He comes from a part, I think, of the Republican Party that still believes in free trade. There are those people that have, for years, decades, the Republican Party.
Look, he's been in the room, and you know that President Trump watches, and anybody who's speaking has an audience of one if you're working for him and speaking on these things. To me, it was this may not be the real thing. And look, he kept saying this is part of a broader overall way of looking at the world, and he's right. President Trump does want to get to the point where he feels like we're not getting ripped off as much, where you have better hand in some of this leverage, and maybe that's piece by piece around the edges. I'm just telling you what I thought after listening to Kevin. Versus
enormous respect for what Kevin says and what you said. Let me just tell you, I didn't have the time to prepare this before I got on air.
Yeah.
White House, I asked them, did you guys do an economic analysis of this, which you asked them? Mm-hmm. They sent me the following. I'll just read you the first line.
Okay.
Tariffs strengthen the American economy, raise wages, and create jobs. That's the first line in their response to me about what the economic analysis of this is. That tells you that they see this as not a leverage thing. Now, maybe, there's two ways to think about this. Maybe these are temporary ones, but that doesn't mean you're out of the woods for a more permanent tariff structure that could be out there soon.
And by the way, the tariffs that President Trump put on China in his first term,
they were kept.
And they were kept by President Biden following that. And so this was a new way of doing business.
I just feel like there's a very big difference between what we do with China, whom we have real national security issues with.
Yeah.
Than with Canada. I was just in Canada. They're such nice people. Mexicans are such nice people. They're our friends.
Well, and here we are. Our neighbors and our biggest trading partners tend to be our allies.
We have a tiny trade deficit with Canada. Let me just tell you a real concern. First of all, one of the economists I read over the weekend said recession in Canada is now the base case. That's one.
Wow.
Two is that when you think about what causes recessions, it's the idling of productive capacity.
Yeah.
What happens to some of the capacity? Now, maybe it's small and the American economy absorbs it. Maybe the Canadian economy doesn't. Having recessions in our northern and southern neighbors is not necessarily the best. By the way, our top trading partners is not necessarily the best for the U.S. export economy.
Yeah, look, there's uncertainty, and a lot of it, and that's going to lead to more volatility in the markets. We're seeing it again this morning.
We'll have our CNBC flash Fed survey over the weekend, but as you said, every single economist marked down GDP.
And marked up inflation.
As a result.
We'll see. We'll see how this plays out.
There are alternative ideas out there.
Yeah. Steve, thank you.
Thanks.
And that is Squawk Pod for today, this very busy News Monday. Please stick with us all week for the onset and impact of potential tariffs. We and our guests will be all over this story. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernan, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Tune in weekday mornings on CNBC at 6 Eastern. Get the best of our TV show right into your ears when you follow Squawk Pod wherever you get your podcasts. We'll meet you right back here tomorrow.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.